that's what active hope really is. It's about feeling the sense of agency and acting on it.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives dedicated to advancing the conversation on multilateralism. And today we're going to be talking about what hope's got to do with it. And with me in the studio, I have Edward Mishaud, our colleague from the Beyond Lab. And online, we're joined by Professor Disa Sauter, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Social Psychology at the University of Amsterdam, and also President of the International Society for Research on Emotion. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today, we're going to be exploring a bit more about affective science and the study of emotions and how they can be harnessed as a powerful driver of sustainability, both at the individual and at the collective level. So we're going to be unpacking a little the science behind emotions and decision-making, and also highlight UN Geneva's role in bringing this knowledge into the multilateral space and showcase perhaps some tangible opportunities for impact, I'm hoping will come out by the end of this. And we're going to be zooming in on why UN Geneva, through the Beyond Lab, is focusing particularly on the role of hope in advancing SDGs and long-term sustainability. So here we go. Perhaps, Disa, you could introduce yourself a little bit more. Tell us more about your work. Help us define what is affective science and how this all started for you in the first place.
So yes, I've been studying emotions for over 20 years. To me, it was immediately the topic that I was drawn to as an undergraduate studying psychology. I thought, everybody is saying that they're interested in what makes people tick, but most people aren't studying that at all. But emotions are really about what makes people tick. They're about our concerns, the things we care about. And that's really the definition of affective science, is the study of emotions. And it's a really profoundly interdisciplinary research area, because you probably know emotions are very complex. And so we need different disciplinary lenses in order to try to understand them. So for example, I myself am trained in psychology, but also there are philosophers, sociologists, neuroscientists, computer scientists, linguists, all contributing different pieces of the puzzle. And a few years ago, I started to become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis. And so I started in my spare time trying to read up on environmental psychology and also to kind of more broadly educate myself about the climate and environmental crises. And then I found myself looking for a way to sort of bring together my different worlds, my research expertise on emotion with this concern that I had about planetary crises. And that's basically now resulted in a new line of research in my lab that is trying to investigate the relationship between emotions and sustainability. And fortunately, I am not alone in believing that the kind of intersection of these two domains is quite an interesting, potentially important aspect to investigate, basically, for researchers, and potentially that this could be useful also for people working in more applied areas.
That's really interesting. And I'm sure you said you started 20 years ago working on emotions. And I'm interested particularly in positive emotions. 20 years ago, we were still heavily into the 6 basic emotions, of which really we can only say happiness is sort of in general, is more of the positive emotions. Tell us a bit more about how that has changed and how your work has enlarged this repertoire of positive emotions and why that matters for human decision-making.
So yes, indeed, research for a long time was very heavily biased towards negative emotions. And this is partly because a lot of research on emotions was dedicated to more clinical applications, so helping people with depression, anxiety, phobias, etc., which is, of course, extremely important. But thankfully, most people, if you ask them, report feeling quite happy most of the time. And what's more, they feel happy in a wide variety of different ways. And so if you think about feeling something like gratitude, the kinds of experiences that make you feel grateful, the sorts of behaviors you might engage in when you're feeling grateful are completely different than if you're feeling proud, for example, or if you're feeling excited. And so in recent years, there's been more and more research into positive emotions and the distinctions between different positive emotional states. And what we're finding is that they are really quite discrete in the sense that they really do different things for us and to us, and they make us do different kinds of things. And so we know in general that emotions are really important for decision making. And that's also true. It's not the case that just feeling good has one type of effect and feeling bad has another type of effect, but also different ways of feeling good will have different effects, and different ways of feeling bad will have different kinds of effects. And so, for example, if you feel angry, that tends to be associated with approach, moving towards things, potentially attacking those things, but it's still an approach. Whereas feeling sad, which is also a negative affective state, is associated with withdrawal. And so we need to look much more with higher granularity at emotions in order to understand how they influence our behaviors, because oftentimes our emotional state intersects with how we act in the world. And that's also what makes them so relevant for investigating sustainability and pro-environmental behavior, because our emotions shape what kinds of behaviors we're likely to engage in. And so we need to consider them, which for a long time wasn't done. Right? In environmental psychology, the focus was very much on cognitive factors, like people prioritize threats that are present and current over threats that are distant in space and time, which is true and very important, but also our emotions play a role, not only our cognitive evaluations.
Absolutely. It's really fascinating. So tell us a little bit more about how the emotions would shape a sort of intention-action gap, and even more so, how this could be of use in collective action.
Right. So how we feel about climate change is one of the most important predictors of, firstly, how severe we think the threat is, which of course can have all sorts of downstream consequences on how we act. You might think of something as straightforward as, do you get insurance or not for your house, depending on how severe you think the threat is to yourself. But also our emotions shape whether we are likely to engage in action, both at the individual level. So do you recycle? Do you opt to buy organic fruit and vegetables, for example? But also whether we engage in collective action. Do you maybe start a petition? Do you maybe vote in a certain way? Do you maybe organize? It doesn't have to be gluing yourself to the road. It can be all sorts of collective action. There's really a wide range of different kinds of behaviors that fall into that category. Also, we know that emotions are important predictors for policy preferences. And of course, those are going to be an important factor in your voting behavior, which is another kind of pro-environmental or anti-environmental behavior, depending on how you vote.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose also climate denial is also an emotional response.
Indeed. And in general, seeking out information relating to climate and potentially avoiding such information and seeking out information that sort of supports a denialist perspective can also be part of an emotional reaction, because facing the threats we actually are dealing with can be an overwhelming emotional experience. And one way that people can try to protect themselves from it can be to basically try to see the reality in a different way that feels less distressing.
But we'd like to encourage people to have hope. So tell us a bit more. What exactly is hope?
Well, hope is an emotion, and like many emotions, it's characterized by something that emotion researchers like to call appraisals. These are basically evaluations that we all make very quickly and automatically, evaluations about the world and about our own relationship to the world around us. And so specifically in the case of hope, it involves thinking about something in the future that you want to happen, but about which there is some level of uncertainty. And we can importantly distinguish between two main types of hope, active hope and passive hope. So passive hope is about waiting for somebody else or hoping for somebody else to bring about this change that we would like to see. Sometimes this is called false hope because it doesn't involve any kind of action on the part of the hopeful person. Now, in some cases, this can nevertheless be a helpful emotion to experience because there are situations in which you really have zero agency, and then keeping hope alive while you hope somebody else will rescue you might be better than losing hope and despairing completely. But in most situations, what is much more functional and helpful is active hope, which is closer to determination. So it's the feeling we have when there is some amount of control for ourselves or our group. And so this is clearly very useful for activating, engaging in behaviors because you're trying to bring about the change you want to see. And what's particularly good about hope is that it helps us focus our attention on the possibilities. So seeing the options that are there. And it's very much a forward-looking emotion. So it kind of helps us mobilize the resources to capitalize on opportunities that exist in the situation in which we are, which may be a challenging one, but there's almost always something that can be done.
How then do we move from a very individualistic sense of hope to one that is collective?
Well, every collective is made up of individuals. And so maybe one way to think about it is that these are not in conflict with each other, but rather, as Bill McKibben, the famous climate activist, likes to say, the best thing you can do for climate as an individual is to stop acting like an individual and act in a collective. I paraphrased. So essentially, the way in which we can be most impactful is typically by acting together with others, almost always, and certainly in the context of climate. And so having hope individually hopefully can lead us to take collective action, which can take, as I mentioned, many different forms.
It's all coming together. So, Edward, tell us a bit more about why you've moved on to hope and why it matters so much for the UN and the multilateral space.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. And it's definitely all of the fantastic prompts that Disa just gave. I think it's really, I've been thinking how best to explain this. I think, first of all, I'd like to just maybe highlight the fact that together with Disa and also Dr. Professor Tobias Brosch with the University of Geneva, that we've been working on this topic now for almost 2 years. And the reason why the Beyond Lab here at UN Geneva, which sits within the Office of the Director General, one of the reasons why we got into this topic was really largely due to the work of Disa and Tobias, to actually engage with them on a special journal article, a journal that they were co-editing called Emotion Review. And they had asked us to think about emotions within the context of the 2030 agenda. And that was something completely new for me personally, and I also know for the team, because we never really thought about emotions in the context of our work. We definitely understood and we were aware of the role of behavioral science, and that's a topic that is quite, I would say, prevalent in the United Nations system. There are many organizations in the UN that have behavioral science teams and units and colleagues working on that, from the World Health Organization to UNICEF to UNDP. But then this aspect of emotions, when my colleague and I were trying to prepare ourselves for this article, we realized that there wasn't that much. And if anything existed, it was really focusing on climate. So being the Beyond Lab and looking at the broader sustainable development agenda, we wanted to understand more in terms of how can emotions and the affective science more broadly, how can that actually influence and shape the work that we do? And first and foremost, it was also trying to understand how could we inform a bit around the narrative that we were seeing a few years ago, which is still continuing around the topic of sustainability, around the topic of climate change, where a lot of the discourse, a lot of the communications were focused more on, I would say, the negative emotions, more on fear, despair, not so much around hope or positivity. Or if there were references to hope and positivity, it was often in the context of maybe what you were saying, Disa, around the passive or the false hope. Just having a hopeful mindset is enough to help us tackle climate change, is enough to help us address social inequalities. So that was kind of the starting point for us. And then in November 2023, we used one of our What's Next series, which is one of our flagship convening platforms, to actually have Disa come to Geneva together with Professor Tobias Brosch and others to really just first and foremost unpack this issue. What are we talking about when we say emotions and sustainability? And that really set us up to be where we are today, to not only be having this podcast, which is part of that kind of outreach and communication, but to be moving towards how can we use the high quality research and evidence that exists around affective science, hope, and other positive emotions to actually inform, hopefully going forward, how do we negotiate in the multilateral space? How do we communicate about the work that we do? And also how do we do outreach and engage people for that kind of collective action?
Disa was saying earlier on that it's not just sort of positive emotions in general, but looking at the different ways that different emotions move us or bring us into action in different ways, and the nuances between all of these. So why hope rather than other emotions?
The focus on hope, and I have to, give credit to a former colleague that we had, Amani Bashili. Amani was working with us earlier this year and last year, so 2024, 2025, to really take this work forward that we were doing collectively. And one of the key aspects of the work that Amani was doing was looking at emotions more broadly. And I think one aspect that she was focused on was looking at the topic of sustainability and climate crisis through the lens of grieving or grief, and looking at that from mapping the stages of grief and trying to come up with a comparison also to activism or engagement in the climate space. And through that, it was quite clear that one key aspect, of course, of this process, and correct me if I'm wrong, Disa, on any of this, but again, it was this element that there is this emergence of hope that the future can be better. There's a large amount of uncertainty, but it's something worth striving for. And I think that kind of, when Amani and another colleague named Pankuri were discussing this with us in the Beyond Lab team, we had to take a decision to say, okay, where do we want to go in this space? And we could also focus on some negative emotions or do a mix, but it was really using hope as kind of an anchor for this project. And we've now arrived at a point where we actually have this within the Beyond Lab. We're calling it the Hope Project. And through that, we've developed a hope methodology, still in the very, very early stages, still a lot of work to do to test and to actually ensure that what we want to proceed with actually is sound. But the idea of focusing on hope, we felt, was a good overarching banner of positivity in this current context where we need more hope and we need more optimism. And so that was really one of the key reasons why we wanted to focus on hope, but also through our conversations that we had many with Disa and with Tobias and others, is that hope is very powerful. And it has that aspect of taking an individual action and linking it up to a collective and having that broad chain of reaction, especially in the topics that we're focused on today.
Can I probe a little bit?
Please.
And sort of ask if you find it's very clear the relevance to civil society, to broader engagement with sustainable development, with the environmental issues and so on. How much would you suggest as a focus on hope in the context of multilateral negotiations?
That's a very good question. Maybe I'll answer it also by just saying that it's also not the Beyond Lab that's focused on this aspect within the multilateral space. We were quite surprised that earlier this year there was a United Nations General Assembly resolution, and there are many, as we know, fortunately. And one of the resolutions that was brought forward by a number of member states was to establish an International Day of Hope. And we were quite surprised, because I remember sharing it with Disa and Tobias, that this language was actually coming out of the General Assembly in a time where, once again, there are not a lot of signals of hope in the multilateral negotiation space. And it was quite clear that, for one, quite reaffirming that we're not the only ones thinking about this topic, but that there are others, member states in particular, that see the importance, first and foremost, of hopeful narratives, of hopeful mindsets, and also outreach, but also tapping into the specific science and evidence around affective science and around emotions for the work that we do. If you look at the resolution, it doesn't necessarily focus on hope, but it talks about the broader role of positive mindsets in the space that we operate in within the multilateral arena, and also trying to use that to influence negotiations. So I don't have a direct answer in terms of how we can bring that into the negotiation space just yet. It's something that we're interested in. It's something that's part of what we hope to do next year in 2026 with the work of the Beyond Lab and the Hope Project, is to see how we can pilot this work and hope and positive mindsets in negotiations. But it's something that we have to develop, and it's also something that we have to approach, I think, quite carefully in terms of the space of negotiations, which is very complex. It's very emotional. It's a good place to start, but also to do it in a way that doesn't disrupt or influence negotiations in an inappropriate way.
But I think it's very clear that there is an appetite for hope, I think we could say. And it's also interesting the way that the Beyond Lab is sort of bridging academia and policy and really looking into the impact there. Would you like to say a little bit more about that?
No, thank you, Amy. Exactly. I mean, that was one of the key pillars of the Beyond Lab, is that we act as, I would say, almost like an innovation studio, for want of a better word, where we bring in different actors and stakeholders to say, okay, how can we link these topics and these mandates that are coming from member states, but also attach that to other stakeholders and partners that are actually doing the research, that are doing the work at country level in different contexts. So a key focus, of course, is partnering with universities and other academic institutions, be it the University of Amsterdam in the case of Disa, University of Geneva, and others as well, but also making links to broader associations that are focused on these fields of areas, such as, for instance, in the field of psychology. Earlier this year, I had the pleasure of taking part in the European Congress of Psychology, which was held in Cyprus. I believe it happens every 2 years. And I was there together with Dr. Brush to talk about the work that we're doing on affective science. And what really struck me is that in the intervention that we did together, was that there were so many psychologists, clinical psychologists, students, and others coming up afterwards saying, this is the type of partnership that we need, is that on their side as well, that there's this desire to get out of kind of the ivory tower of academia, to get out of the research silos, and actually see practical, tangible applications in other arenas, and one of them being in the multilateral space. And then vice versa, it's the same for the United Nations. We also need to get the work that we're doing outside of the resolutions, outside of the policy briefs, outside of the negotiations, to see it go into also the academic space and elsewhere, to lead, consequently to these type of tangible policies and programs and impact in communities.
Yes, absolutely. I've noticed a huge push in the world of psychology towards this type of work. Let's talk now about the impact. Where is all of this leading? And you've hinted at quite a few things. Let's talk about leveraging emotions in communications, for example.
Maybe Disa, you also want to come in here as well. But I would just say on that, I mean, one thing that we're quite interested in, of course, is the overall approach of hopeful and positive messaging in communications. And even at the Beyond Lab, how can we frame our communications and position to be more positive, to be more hopeful in terms of the type of articles, the type of individuals that we interview, the type of projects that we want to showcase. Of course, it's not to diminish the severity of the challenges, but it's to really spotlight solutions and also collective engagement. And one platform that we have, we're calling it the Beyond Action platform, which is a website where we bring together a magazine that we have, the Beyond magazine, and also a podcast series. But it's really to focus on that aspect of highlighting the possibilities beyond the current status quo. And I think that goes back to Disa's original definition that she gave of hope, which is this kind of future forward-looking, positive uncertainty, but it's something worth striving for. So I think that's just one aspect, is that through our communications, we want to infuse it with not being naive or undermining anything, but leading with hope and leading with positivity.
And Disa, I was going to say that so much of your work has focused really on the emotional engagement, addressing the climate crisis, planetary crises, and other social inequality as well through emotional engagement. Tell us a bit more about that.
So I really want to echo what Edward said, that if we want to elicit active hope, we really need to communicate the sorts of steps people can take individually as well as collectively, because that's what active hope really is. It's about feeling the sense of agency and acting on it. And so together with maybe communicating, the need for stronger policy relating to climate, you would also want to sandwich that in between conveying that politicians are very sensitive to public opinion on this kind of issue. If we actually implemented this policy, this is the effects it would have, the impact it would actually create. And so that's the sort of communication that can elicit active hope. And what's also really important there is that emotions are about concerns. They're about what we care about. And people care about different things. And so one person's most hopeful action may look different from another person's hopeful action. And that means that we need to present kind of an array of different domains in which people can become active. So one person might be touched by concerns for the climate because of, sense of morality, but that's not going to be everyone. Somebody else might be concerned about the health impact of burning fossil fuels. That's how you're going to reach that person, because that's their concern. Somebody else might be worried about the financial risks that come with increasingly erratic weather. And so that's then how you would capture that person's concern and activate their sense of hope and agency. And so I think also there's no one size fits all in terms of communicating to trigger hope, but rather it's about aligning people's concerns with the actions they can take. And I mean, the blessing and curse is that the climate crisis is such an all-encompassing challenge that it will touch on everybody's concern in one way or another.
Yeah, I read a paper the other day talking about a different way of seeing hope, and the why power as well as the way power and the willpower to this. So yeah, absolutely. I love the way that you term hopeful action.
Just one thing I like to just prompt Disa is because one thing that really stands out, and I remember this to this day because we had this What's Next back in November 2023, and Disa, you mentioned about the importance of having a Swiss Army knife of emotions, and I really like that. So I don't know if you want to highlight that, because I think it's really also linked to this topic of application.
Sure. Yes. So I think humans have a bit of a bad reputation in a way as pleasure seekers, right? We're lazy and we're just looking to have a good time. And there's some truth to that, but we actually are driven by really a wealth of different goals, needs, desires. Some of those are to just momentarily feel good, but we're also striving for meaning and fulfillment and connection, etc. And so different emotions also fulfill different kinds of functions. They help us accomplish different kinds of goals. And so negative emotions are incredibly important, and we probably wouldn't have survived as a species if we didn't have a fear system helping us detect threats. But if you're just fearful all the time, that is not a functional or adaptive state. You become paralyzed and overwhelmed and frankly miserable and in need of therapeutic aid. So fear is useful, but we cannot have a menu made up of just different flavors of fear. That would not be a delicious meal. So we do need other emotions as well. So you could say that for climate action, we do need to have some sense that there is a problem, right? We cannot be only driven by positivity and hope. There is a massive global challenge that we are in the midst of, and we should be concerned. We should be worried and fearful and maybe even angry. But if you try to act over a longer period of time on only a diet of fear and anger, that will become incredibly exhausting. And we know that there's, for example, quite a common phenomenon called activist burnout. So people engaging in collective action who are very upset about the state of the world. It's really exhausting to be in that state. And so what you also need is some positivity in order to create a balance that keeps you going. It doesn't sort of negate the anger and the fear and the worry that you feel. And any climate activist will confirm that they still feel those things, but it can be complemented with feelings of positive connection, with collective agency, with determination, and with active hope. And so we need to have access to a whole bunch of different tools in order to accomplish our goals. We cannot just be driven by all these exhausting negative emotions, because we can't carry on forever just on the basis of those.
So to the people who are listening, who are thinking about, well, how can I cultivate hope? What would you say? I mean, this isn't entirely dispositional or genetic. So how can we encourage people, and how can people themselves build hope for themselves?
I think that storytelling is a very powerful tool, which I must say us scientists have not sufficiently, I think, capitalized on. But others in the world know very well that all kinds of art is consumed, for want of a better word, engaged with, very much with the goal of eliciting emotions. And it's often very effective. You know, you go and watch a movie, you read a book, you listen to music, you go to an art gallery. These kinds of triggers really bring about emotions. And so exposing yourself to hopeful stories about people who have acted and created change, I think is a very effective way to stimulate more feelings of hope. For me personally, talking to others who, in the face of adversity and great challenge, continue to work selflessly for the greater good is what makes me hopeful. And I have to say, being engaged in collective action actually means that you get exposed to more of these kinds of stories because you're surrounded by people who are doing this kind of work. And so if you take up campaigning on whatever issue touches you that relates to the climate, biodiversity, sustainability, you will find that you will come into contact with people who are doing that important work, and they are full of inspiring stories from their own experience and from others within their network. So that would be the the kind of secret hope-inducing pill that I would prescribe.
Oh, I love that secret. Thank you for sharing it.
So, it's a secret if I'm telling you.
Everyone knows.
I think this is a perfect way to draw to a close with a couple of hopeful stories. So, Edward, do you have something extra to add?
I do, and I'm just trying to think, because Disa, you've framed it so nicely. I'm trying to, what can I share? I think maybe what I referred to earlier, what might seem a little dry on the United Nations resolution, but actually that, to me, that represents hope in the space that we are in. The fact that a number of many member states, very diverse from different regions and geographical regions on the planet, that came together and put forward a resolution that called for an International Day of Hope on July 12th. I think is something that very positive, and it made me feel very hopeful for not only sustainable development and the 2030 agenda, but also for this specific area of work. Because I know when we started to talk about the HOPE project, effective science more broadly, emotions in our space, including here in the United Nations office at Geneva, but when with other partners, we would often get this kind of question mark face and, as you opened with, what's hope got to do with it? And I think now that we have these type of resolutions and also movements, that it actually brings greater awareness to the role of positive mindsets and positive thinking in the multilateral space. And I think there's a general maybe orientation towards that more and more, especially when we do speak to permanent missions here in Geneva. So those offices that represent national governments, that there's really interest in this topic. They may not necessarily understand it right away and why we're looking at this, but there's appetite to know more. So that's something that gives me a lot of hope and actually motivates me to continue this work that we're doing in partnership with Disa and others.
Wonderful. And you, Disa, would you share with us some of your greater good news?
Yes, I have to say that I have the privilege of working with students, which is also a great way to stay hopeful, because all of that youthful energy and ideas is also very inspiring. But more specifically, I felt one of the most intense and strong feelings of hope from some of my campaigning work. So I've been involved for some years in the campaign around pension divestment, so trying to get pension funds to divest funds from the fossil fuel industry. And specifically, I was campaigning for ABP to divest, and that's the largest pension fund in the Netherlands, one of the largest in the world. And they had, at the time that this campaign was running, about 15 billion euros invested in fossil fuel companies. And so this was a campaign that ran for many years. I was one of many, 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 many people working on it. There were people who created petitions. There were people who organized demonstrations. There were people who occupied the lobby of ABP. There were people who had meetings with the board. So every possible flavor of campaigning you could imagine. There were even people preparing to take them to court. And I was involved with a group of Dutch academics pressuring the Dutch university boards. And they got interested in this issue, the university boards, and then put together an expert group on climate and finance to advise the pension fund on how they should invest sustainably. Shortly after this happened, in combination with all the other campaigning going on around this issue, ABP announced that they would divest all of their money from fossil fuel companies. And I had planned to go for a run on the morning that I got this message that they had finally said they would divest, and I felt like I was flying. It was incredibly how empowering. And so I think just thinking about how really it wasn't one person, it wasn't finding the right strategy, it was the combined effort of all these different people and different people finding their way to campaign and express themselves and try to have an impact. All of that together is what created really quite serious impact, positive impact. So that gives me hope.
It certainly does. What a beautiful example of collective action. Thank you both very much for bringing so much hope and joy on this sunny day in Geneva with our sweeping views over the lake and the joyful Mont Blanc. Awe-inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.